Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this tutorial I'm going to be sharing with you how to introduce a sleeve onto a garment, be it a top or a dress. I'm going to be working with a one-piece sleeve, which means that the sleeve has one seam in it. However, if you're working with a two-piece sleeve, whereby you would have an upper sleeve and an undersleeve, and you've got two seams, that's not a problem at all. You just need to make sure that you sew the two seams together when I sew the one seam. I'm going to presume that you're working from a pattern that has a sleeve, and hopefully I can share some tips and techniques that I use to improve your sewing and make sleeves easier. So as you can see here, I've got my sleeve cut out in my fabric, and I presume you're going to be working with a pattern that has a sleeve that you can work from. Now, I've marked the things that I need to mark on my sleeve, and for me that's these notches here. Now, you could either mark those with carbon paper and a tracing wheel, you could use tailor's torques, you could just snip into the notches if you wanted to. For this, I've actually used some pen that will come off with water, an erasable pen. So, the top marking here, this is the marking that's going to join up to the shoulder seam of my garment. We've got a marking for the front and a marking for the back of the armhole. When working with a sleeve, you will always have a single notch for the front and a double notch for the back. Now, I've finished the edges of my fabric using the serger or overlocker. If you've got a serger or overlocker, I would recommend that you finish them now before we join the sleeve seam together. But if you're working with perhaps an overcast stitch or a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine or pinking shears, then don't worry about it at this stage. I would recommend that you finish the seams once we've sewn the sleeve seam together. Now, the first thing that we're going to need to do is to make sure that the sleeve is going to fit in to the armhole of our garment. To do that, we're going to complete an easing or gathering stitch. The amount of extra fabric you have will depend on the pattern that you're working with and how it has been designed. On most commercial patterns, you'll find that there are two small dots around this area of your sleeve, and generally speaking, the pattern will ask you to complete an easing or gathering stitch from one small dot across the top to the other small dot. I personally find that these are slightly too close together and you end up with a lot of puckering or gathering along this top of the sleeve cap. So instead, what I would personally do is to complete your easing or gathering stitches from your double notch all across the top of the sleeve to the single notch the other side. You can either do this on the machine. On the machine, it's a stitch length of 4mm with no back stitching, leaving nice long tails to pull on. Or you can do it by hand, a running stitch if you would prefer. You want to do this in the seam allowance. So my seam allowance for this project here is 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. So I'll do my first row just inside the seam allowance, approximately ½ an inch, 1.2 centimetres from the raw edge of the fabric. I would then complete another row of the easing or gathering stitch in between the previous sewn line and the raw edge of the fabric. Join me at the machine and I'm going to show you how I do this and what it looks like. Complete the easing stitch around the sleeve cap between the single and double notch. You want to complete the stitch length of 4mm and you want to work your way around, and I'm going to be completing this in my seam allowance, so I'm using 4/8 or ½ an inch, 1.2 centimetres, because my seam allowance is 5/8, 1.5 centimetres. You just want to make sure it's in the seam allowance. At the start and the end, you don't want a back stitch, so when I'm nearing the end here, I'm simply going to lift it out of the machine and leave a nice long tail. Hopefully you can see the first row of easing or gathering stitching here. Now we're going to be completing another row in between the first row and the edge of the fabric, so in the centre of what's left of the seam allowance. Now we're going to be completing the second row of the easing or gathering stitch. Again, stitch length 4 on the sewing machine. We're going to be doing this row in between the first row and the raw edge of the fabric. Again, start with nice long tails, no back stitching. And you just want to work your way along, aiming for the middle of this sort of section you have left between the edge of the fabric and the stitching. This doesn't have to be neat, it's just a case of trying to keep both of the rows in the seam allowance as much as possible. However, we will be removing them when you have finished inserting your sleeve. At the end, I haven't backstitched, and again I'll remove this with a nice long tail of thread. Hopefully you can see the 2 rows of easing stitching that we completed across the top of the sleeve cap between the single and double notch. Both rows of stitching should be in the seam allowance. Now the next thing to do is to actually sew up the sleeve seam. So to do that, you're going to be taking your sleeve and positioning the right sides together. So this is my right side, this is the wrong side where I've got my markings. We're going to be positioning the whole of this edge together. So the 2 edges of fabric need to be next to one another. We're going to start with the hem. So we're starting always sewing from the hem up. And we're going to take some pins and pop some pins in with the point of the pin facing the hem, so that as we're sewing this, it's really easy for us to take the head of the pin out because the head of the pin is facing us. So we're going to be sewing all the way up the sleeve seam. Now you might have a 1-piece sleeve, which is what this is when you've got 1 seam, and you might have a 2-piece sleeve, which is when you'll have 2 seams that you need to sew. If you're working with a 2-piece sleeve, depending on how large the 2-piece is, you might find that you actually need to sew the seams together before you complete the easing or gathering stitching. So my sleeve seam is pinned and ready to go. I'm now going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to sew this following our seam allowance for this garment, which is 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. We will backstitch at the start and at the end. Remember to turn your sewing machine back to your standard stitch length of 2.5 millimetres. We want to start at the hem of the sleeve, working with a 2.5 millimetre standard stitch length. We'll stitch forwards and backwards, and we're going to be following the seam allowance that you're working with. For me, that's 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. Taking the pins out as I go and just feeding this through the machine. You want to make sure that obviously if you had any notches along the seam, they've been matched up, and that the top and the bottom of the seam also matches between the 2 layers. When we get to the end here, we're going to backstitch again to secure it. As you can see, I've sewn the seam of my sleeve. I've pressed the seam allowances open, and if you were completing an overcast or a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine to finish the raw edges of your fabric, I would do that now. The same goes for pinking shears. I've also finished the hem here. What you do for the hem will depend on the fabric that you're working with and perhaps the pattern. Now we're going to start introducing the sleeve into the garment. We're going to look at our easing or gathering stitches again, and we're actually going to pull on these so that we can shrink in the top of the sleeve cap slightly. It will make it easier for us to position it into the garment if we do it at this stage here. I would like you to pull on 2 of the threads. Now, we've got 2 rows of easing or gathering stitches, so there'll be 2 threads on the right side and 2 threads on the wrong side of your fabric. It doesn't matter whether you pull the threads from the right side or the wrong side. You just must pull the 2 threads together. So I'm holding onto these firmly now with my right hand, and with my left hand I'm going to move the fabric away. And as you can see, that's creating a gather. So I'm pulling on the threads and moving the fabric, or should I say sliding the fabric along the threads. And that's creating a gather. Now, for the majority of the times you're putting a sleeve in, you won't want it to look as gathered as this. I always explain the word easing by saying that it's a mini gathering. So the process of gathering has happened, but it actually doesn't look like it's gathered when it's actually sewn in. So we'll do a little bit from one side, and then I would recommend that you go ahead and you collect 2 threads from the other side, and you pull that a little bit as well. Now you're going to need to try and position all of the gathering or easing around the sleeve cap so that it's even. At the moment, I've got a mass of it in different places and none here. So I'm going to use my fingers and I'm just going to work that around. I tend to use sort of my fingers, my nails, and just sort of move it around so that you're going to get as even a look as possible. Now, if you're working with a particularly difficult fabric, this could be something quite slippy, or you find that as you're pulling on your basting or gathering threads one side, that you end up starting to lose them on the other side, then what you can do is actually pop a pin in to actually block the threads and stop them from coming out. So position a pin in with the point towards the raw edge of the fabric. And all you're going to do is take the 2 threads from one side and you're going to move that around the bottom of the pin and then around the top of the pin. So to the left at the bottom of the pin and to the left at the top of the pin. You've just got to imagine that you're writing the number 8, and it's a figure of 8 motion that you can do around the pin. And all this is going to do is to stop the threads from being pulled out. The worst thing is when you're working to pull the easing in on one side and all of a sudden you realise you've pulled the threads out. Because unfortunately, if that happens, you will have to redo your easing stitches. What you're aiming for at this stage is to have a sleeve that is shaped something like this. You want it to look like it could be positioned into the armhole of the garment. You've got the easing or gathering along this top edge and it's pulling that section in. I generally go by the process that I would prefer to have more easing or gathering than I will need at this point. I find it easier to actually let the easing or gathering out than to try and ease or gather a little bit more when I'm positioning it into the garment in a second. Once you're happy with this, we then need to collect our garment. So your garment needs to be at a suitable state for you to be able to introduce the sleeve. You'll need to make sure that the armhole is one piece. And by that I mean that you've sewn any seams that you need to sew in order to create a circular armhole. That could be side seams, it could be princess seams, it could be shoulder seams. Now the first thing that I like to do is to turn my garment and my sleeve with the right side of the fabric out. By doing this, it allows you to check that you're positioning the correct sleeve into the correct armhole. Because as we mentioned earlier, the sleeve shouldn't be symmetrical. By looking at the notches on the sleeve and those notches on the garment, remember you should have a single notch for the front and a double notch for the back, and these should be the same on the armhole of your garment. This will clearly tell you which is the front and which is the back of your sleeve. So I've got a double notch here and a single notch on this side, which means that this sleeve is going to be going into this armhole. I'm going to start by matching the underarm of my garment, in this case it's a seam, with the underarm of my sleeve, which is also a seam. Now, in some instances, especially if you had a 2-piece sleeve, this would not be a seam and you'd be matching a marking of some description, generally a square or a large circle, with another marking or seam on the underarm of the garment. So those two are going to go together. Now I'm going to put my hand inside to collect the one seam and the other seam, just like so. And I'm going to hold those nice and firm whilst I move the garment so that I can actually see the seams or the edges of the fabric that I'm putting together. You might find that you need to undo the fastening of your garment, and this will just give you a little bit more playroom. So we've already matched the two seams together. I haven't let go of that. And I'm going to position a pin to hold that in place. I'm then going to work my way around the armhole. So the bottom part of the sleeve isn't gathered, and that's the bit that we need to do first. So from the underarm, we're going to move to the right and to the left up until we get to our easing stitches on both sides. And we're simply going to be matching the raw edges of the fabric together. We've automatically got the right sides of the fabric together here. You should be looking at the wrong side of your fabric and also the wrong side of your fabric. And we're just going to work up to those easing stitches, positioning the pins in. And I'm pinning like I normally do, the same as I would be sewing. Now you've pinned the whole of the underarm, we can have a look at the top. So this is my armhole and this is my sleeve that is nicely gathered inside. The first thing we need to do is to find the notch on the sleeve to match up with the shoulder seam on the armhole. So I've got a nice clear blue notch there, and that's going to go in line with the seam at the shoulder of my garment, and I'll pop a pin in there. Now you should have the underarm and the shoulder, or the top notch of the sleeve, matched. We now need to pin the rest of the sleeve into the armhole. So we've got a section between those areas on either side. Now you should see that the armhole is nice and smooth and is actually a little bit bigger than the gathered, eased area of the sleeve. So what we need to do here is to make them the same size. As I mentioned, I generally ease or gather in a little bit more to my sleeve so that if anything, I have this situation where I need to let some out. So I'm just going to use my thumb and forefinger to move some of that easing out until it's the same size as the armhole. Once you're happy that they're the same size, I then work with the middle to the middle. So we pick just by eye here, the middle of the sleeve and approximately the middle of the armhole. Position those together, matching the edges of the fabric, and we'll pin in there. And then I move to the next section, so the middle to the middle. And you'll notice here that I'm always pinning on what is the body or the garment, not the sleeve. So the garment is facing up. And then again, middle to middle, and that side's gone in really nicely. Okay, the same for the other side. So I'm going to let out the sleeve because again, the armhole is bigger here. Using thumb and forefinger just to make those the same size. It's still a little bit too small. And you can use, I tend to use my nails if any of the sort of easing or gathering stitches get a bit caught. Okay, now we're the same size there. So again, middle to middle, middle of the sleeve to middle of the armhole. And again, positioning the pins on the body, so body side up. And then again, the next section, middle to middle. And there'll be one final section just there. So as you can see, we are pinned in. So once you're happy that you've pinned your sleeve into the armhole, two things that I tend to do. One of which is I just use my nails to move any of the sort of lumps or the puckers of the easing around to make sure that when we sew this, you don't end up with a pucker or a ridge. And I'm just making sure we've got a nicely smooth, evenly gathered sleeve there. I'll also make sure that all my pins are going the same direction so that they're easy for me to remove when I actually take them out and when we're sewing around this. Remember, we're going to be sewing in a circle. Now we're going to be using a clover fork pin like you see here. And this is going to help join or make sure that we get a match between the underarm seam of the garment and the underarm seam of the sleeve. Now we could just stitch around this on the sewing machine and we might be lucky enough to get a match, but it can be frustrating if the two seams end up being out ever so slightly. So by using a clover fork pin, we're going to make sure that that doesn't happen. So what do we need to do? You want to take the normal pin out that joined those two seams together. And what you need to do first is to make sure that the seams are sitting one on top of each other, just like so. So we're matching that up by eye. You're then going to take the clover fork pin and we're going to position it with the raised section of this sitting up. The legs are going to go either side of what we're trying to match, and we're just going to go in and then out again. Now when we get to the sewing machine, we're going to stitch straight over the clover fork pin. You do need to be careful to make sure that you don't hit it, but the clover fork pin was designed for quilters and patchwork to help make sure that you get a nice join. So you shouldn't have a problem. Now before we go to the sewing machine, do a last check, make sure that all of the gathering or easing stitches are nice and neat, you don't have any puckers. If you do, use your fingers to move those along. We're going to go to the machine and we're going to start sewing always in the underarm. So we'll start about here to make sure that we cover the whole of the underarm first before going up and over the top of the sleeve cap. So I've taken the front section off the sewing machine. You should find you'll be able to remove something, or perhaps you won't have anything there in the first place. And this should make it easier for you to position your sleeve onto this little section. Now you may or may not be able to get the section inside the sleeve depending on how tight the armhole is and the sort of shape of the armhole. So if not, then you'll just need to keep moving the fabric round with it all on the top. So what we're going to be doing, this is the underarm seam. We're starting before the underarm seam where the easing and gathering stitches ended on the sleeve cap. We're going to be completing the seam allowance that came with your pattern. For me, that's 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters. I'm going to be stitching all the way around using the 2.5 millimeter stitch length, stitching over the clover pin and back stitching at the start and at the end, removing the pins as I go. So the most important thing when completing a sleeve is that you don't get any puckers or anything underneath. So I'm going to keep feeding this through, and what I would normally do, my left hand will be checking on the top edge, my right hand will be getting the next bit of fabric ready and checking that that is nice and smooth too. So again, get the next bit ready. And you can take this slowly, you're just going to work your way around doing this all the way around. So here, I'm going to be sewing over the clover pin. Just be careful, but you shouldn't have a problem with it. Just take it slow and steady. And then get the next bit ready. And I'm moving any of the fabric away that I don't want to catch. And I'm just watching the edge of my fabric with my guideline. Now to give you a slightly closer view, I'm going to keep working my way around, still moving the fabric, so left hand is smoothing, right hand is checking for lumps and bumps underneath. Now, if you were doing this in a difficult fabric, say a silk or something that was exceptionally slippy, had any movement, or if you were trying to match a stripe or something, I would most certainly position my sleeve in by hand sewing it in first, so basting or tacking. And then I would complete the stitches on the sewing machine and then remove my original basting or tacking. Now I'm back to the end. I'm going to back stitch here to secure, and then we're done. We can take this out and trim the threads. One minor thing to add is that as I was going round, I made sure that any of my tails from my basting or gathering stitches were out of the way so that they didn't get caught in the seam or end up being on the right side of the garment. So I made sure to pull them out to the right as I was sewing. Now once you've finished sewing all the way around, take a look on the inside or on the sleeve side of your seam. If you have any little catches of sleeve fabric, and if they're very, very small, then what you can generally do is just use your nails and your fingers to sort of move them out and away so that they're not visible on the right side. If you find that doesn't work and they're still visible, then I would recommend that you unpick a very small section and just redo that section, backstitching at the start and at the end. The next step is to remove the original easing or gathering stitches that we put in. You're going to want to unpick these with a sharp pair of scissors or an unpicker and just get them out of the way. Now if you did them correctly, they should be in the seam allowance of the sleeve and they should be easy for you to remove. And there you have it. The sleeve has been introduced into the garment. A final step would be to finish the seam allowances. You could do that on the serger or overlocker. Alternatively, you could use the overcast stitch or a zigzag stitch or even pinking shears just to tidy up the pesky fraying edges. Generally speaking, I don't press my sleeves unless I have a particular problem that I'm trying to solve. If you think you need to press it, make sure you do this lightly and very carefully. Press the seam allowances towards the sleeve. The seam allowances must always go into the sleeve. And make sure that you do it very gently so that you don't distort the volume in the sleeve cap. I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial and that you learned something new. I hope that next time you go to put a sleeve into a garment, it is slightly easier. Thanks for watching and all the best with your sewing.